Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk off the stories of film, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, development stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film made. Now, this podcast has also now been going for over 5 years, and it's developed quite a lot in that time, and the stories that I was telling in the very, very early stages were a lot briefer than the ones you get now. So what I've been slowly doing is just revisiting one or two of the films I want to talk about a lot more, where I've learnt a lot more, and that's certainly the first of the two movies I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. So, as always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer, and I'll come to the story of this particular movie, again, the other side of this.
I've been down here too long. It's time for me to ascend.
From the sewers of Gotham, a new villain emerges.
You didn't invite me, so I crashed.
From the rooftops of Gotham, the perfect enemy comes to life.
I am Catwoman. Hear me roar. Yeah.
And the only one who can save this city is a creature of the night.
Hey, stud. I thought we had something together.
We do.
While she craves a romance.
So that was a clip from one of the films I watched the most in my youth, 1992's Batman Returns, directed by Tim Burton. Screenplay credited to Daniel Waters, with story credit to Daniel Waters and Sam Hamm, and a cast led by Michael Keaton, Danny DeVito, Michelle Pfeiffer, Christopher Walken, Michael Gough and Pat Hingle. So Tim Burton's Batman came out in 1989 and, I mean, most of us know this like the back of our hand now, was a massive success. It redefined what blockbuster cinema was. It kick-started, although it took a while for everyone to follow it up really, a new interest in superhero cinema, and also it announced Tim Burton as a major force in blockbuster filmmaking. The one person who didn't seem particularly pleased about that was Tim Burton, because he was open fairly quickly about the fact that the idea of doing Batman 2 was not something massively interesting to him, that the 1989 film had physically exhausted him, that there were an awful lot of cooks on that project. He was taking input from people that I don't think he particularly enjoyed taking input from. I've covered the film before on this podcast. And the pressure didn't even let up until after the much hyped release of the film. And so he jumped from Batman as quickly as he could really onto something a lot more personal. That would be Edward Scissorhands, starring Johnny Depp. And so he was on a promotional tour for that. And he was he was being asked about Batman 2, and he was talking even then about how it was the movie that he made that he'd felt least emotionally close to, that he was more distant from him. And whenever I come to a Tim Burton story on this podcast, I just go to the key text, which is Mark Salisbury's excellent book, Burton on Burton. And in there, Tim Burton explains, he said, I didn't want to do the Batman sequel initially because I was kind of burnt out and I didn't know what I could bring to it. And he said, it took me a long time to get interested in it again. And part of it was all those big, weird circumstances, like not having a minute, working 7 days a week under really harsh conditions, not having a chance to think, not having the script sorted out. And he would reiterate, it's the one movie I feel more detached from than the others. Now, just because Tim Burton wasn't instantly declaring he was interested in doing Batman 2, well, it wasn't going to stop Warner Brothers, that was sitting on an enormous mountain of money it had made from the first film. And so Sam Hamm, who had penned the first Batman film, along with Warren Scarron, he got to work on a first draft of what a new Batman movie would look like. Now, this was an era before stars and directors being signed up to multi-contract deals. And so when Hamm was starting to write his script, Michael Keaton wasn't even signed up to reprise the role of Batman. And so there was conversation really about, do you want this film to continue the story of the first Batman? Do you want it to go completely independent? And the early drafts and the early work were, it would be a continuation. It would pick up where the first Batman left off. Now, Burton was still engaged with the process and Warner Brothers wanted him back. And so he took a look at the script that Sam Hamm had written, but he wasn't really winning him over. Now, instead, what he was drawn to was the idea of bringing a character like Catwoman into the mix. A character just morally a lot more ambiguous. Are they a good person? Are they a bad person? Just where the lines weren't particularly clear. And so it was producer Denise Denovi who suggested instead, why not talk to this screenwriter Daniel Waters, who had just enjoyed success with the dark hit Heathers, starring Christian Slater and Winona Ryder. And so Burton, in conversation with Daniel Waters, put forward the idea of Catwoman as the foe in Batman 2. Now, Waters got to this and got to it fast. And in fact, this would soon be fleshed out and there would be a version of this story that also brought the Penguin into the conversation too. In fact, Waters would develop a script that saw Batman against 3 villains. It would be the Penguin, it would be Catwoman, and also a power-mad businessman called Max Schreck. That name is a hat tip that some of you may be aware of. And Waters, going into the project, he admitted he wasn't really a fan of the 1989 Batman, but also going into it too, his brief was relatively loose, that he wasn't being given huge mandates by Tim Burton and by Warner Brothers as to what this should be, at least not at first. And so he could develop the story that he felt would fit a lot better. Now, the idea of 3 villains in a film, this was not an era where criticism was rife about villain-packed comic book movies. And so this, in fact, was arguably the first to do it, to put so many foes just in one film. The exception, of course, being the 1966 very campy Batman movie, which I've got a lot of time for, with a lot of villains in, but not quite in the same mould as this. Burton would argue that of the villains chosen ultimately for the film, he found all of them interesting. Why wouldn't he put them in? There was this conversation about continue the idea of the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Vicky Vale from the first movie. Vicky Vale played ultimately by Kim Basinger, and in fact the only narrative tissue that would link 1989's Batman with what became 1992's Batman Returns is a throwaway line about Vicky Vale. But it just wasn't really clicking with Burton. He too was wanting to do something standalone. And as it turned out, Michael Keaton was also far more interested in doing something standalone. So this all eventually became official in January of 1991, once Edward Scissorhands was out into the world, and the Los Angeles Times reported at the start of 91 that Tim Burton would indeed be back for Batman 2. Filming would begin in 1991, the film would be released in the summer of 1992, and Michael Keaton would be reprising the role of the Caped Crusader as well, landing a hefty pay increase for his troubles. And so the rest of the cast could start to come together as Waters continued to develop the script. Now, in the role of Catwoman, there was a lot of speculation as to who would take that on, and there was also a lot of interest now, from A-list stars, both in music and also in film. And with some, I mean, you can understand why as well. This was guaranteed hit, an iconic character as well, and it's why names such as Cher and Madonna were thrown into the mix fairly early here. The first person I could find actively linked with the role of Selina Kyle and Catwoman is the singer Jodie Watley, whose name was very, very briefly mentioned right the way back in 1989. So the Catwoman chat was predating really where we got to at this point. But it was Annette Bening who would prevail and would be cast in the role. One of the people who would be hugely disappointed to miss out would be Michelle Pfeiffer. As you probably know, we're coming back to Michelle Pfeiffer shortly. But shortly after her casting, Annette Bening learned she was pregnant, had to drop out of the movie, and then one of the most famous stories of the development of Batman Returns would play out. Because Sean Young was originally cast in the role of Vicky Vale in the first Batman movie, but a riding accident and the subsequent injury meant that she had to withdraw from that film, which is when Kim Basinger came in. Now, Sean Young had her eyes really set on the role of Catwoman, and she was going to work hard to try and get the role. And she turned up at the Warner Brothers complex in Burbank in America in her own Catwoman costume. The story goes, the urban legend goes really, that she went on to the Warner Brothers lot to try and track Tim Burton down, and Tim Burton was apparently cowering in his office, locking himself in so he didn't have to see her. Print the legend is a little bit of that. It wasn't actually how it played out. Tim Burton just happened not to be in his office, but apparently Sean Young did manage to track down one of the bosses of the studio, Mark Canton, and also managed to track down Michael Keaton as well. And when she didn't land the role, she did the talk show circuit in the US, made a lot of noise about her lack of casting. But the problem here was that Tim Burton just didn't want her in the role, just didn't see her in the role. And when Annette Bening did withdraw as Catwoman, it was Michelle Pfeiffer who Burton zeroed in on. I mean, he never in the end met Sean Young, but instead he did have a meeting with Michelle Pfeiffer, and the pair quickly clicked. Also, Pfeiffer was really willing to commit to the weirdness of the role, things like putting a live bird in your mouth at one point, which she did during the production, and really going to the edges of the character. Now, she knew that taking on this role was an undertaking and a half, and she would launch into months of intense preparation and training just to get herself ready for the intense fighting sequences in the movie. While she was doing that, the rest of the casting could play out. Next on the list to cast was the role of the Penguin, the dual role of Oswald Cobblepot and the Penguin, and the Hollywood trade press threw names into the mix again. That Danny DeVito was always thought to be the leading contender for the part, but amongst the names that were in, that People magazine, for instance, threw in Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman as options, but apparently they didn't really come anywhere close to it. Burton was really interested in one stage at casting Marlon Brando as the Penguin, but firmly rejected by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers had enough trouble working with him on Superman and wasn't massively keen to put itself through a Marlon Brando experience again. And so it was DeVito who bubbled up to the top fairly quickly as well. And DeVito had been a good friend of Jack Nicholson, worked with him on the film Hoffa for one. And so Nicholson and DeVito had a chat, and Nicholson very much advised DeVito, if you get the chance to do this role, you should take this role. I mean, Nicholson had made himself incredibly rich due to the very, very famous deal he struck to play the Joker in 1989's Batman. Warner Brothers wasn't going to pay that kind of money or do that kind of deal again, but still, it would pay handsomely to land the cast for its Batman film, because why on earth wouldn't it? This was the biggest film it had in development at this stage, and again, this was a surefire hit, surely. Now, once DeVito was on board, there was some rewrite work that was done primarily around the character of the Penguin, and it would be fair to say that Daniel Waters was not particularly interested in doing it. In fact, he pushed back on some of the changes that Tim Burton wanted, some of the changes the studio really wanted. Now, one of the conditions that Burton secured in returning to the world of Batman was he would have a lot more creative control over this, that he wouldn't have to take quite so many studio notes, he wouldn't quite have quite so many overbearing producers telling him what to do, and this could be a lot more of a Tim Burton film than the first Batman movie was. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't aware that he had to serve an audience. And so changes were suggested and Waters didn't want to do it. And so Wesley Strick, who'd been working on Cape Fear for Martin Scorsese, was brought in just to make some of the alterations. Now, Waters would reflect in a retrospective piece to Vulture that he was definitely more involved with the characters, but he says, but then there are these plot elements of the firstborn children of Gotham City that I had nothing to do with. I was like, what does that say? What the cluck is this bit? I think that's what he says. And he said, I realised, well, I didn't have much of a plot for Batman Returns. It really was kind of this strange film of strange people interacting in a city, and I didn't concern myself with the A to B of it, which is where Strick came in really, just to try and put a little bit more thread through the middle. Now, it should be noted that Waters would get total credit for the screenplay in the eventual Writers Guild of America arbitration, and Wesley Strick didn't, but it's known that Strick came in and did some of the surgery on the screenplay. Going back to the casting then, by March of 1991, Variety was now suggesting that the character Robin was going to appear in Batman 2, albeit under the name of the Kid. And the idea here was a little bit of setting the character up for whatever Batman 3 would turn out to be, and then bring Robin into that story instead. Marlon Wayans was reported as being cast, but the filmmakers denied that the character was ever going to appear, and Robin wouldn't appear in the end for another film. That would be a whole other story. For Max Schreck, there was a little bit of talk of David Bowie and of an offer going out to him, but quite whether he entertained it or how tangible that was is unclear really. What was clear was that Bowie was going to make Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me with David Lynch instead, and so the name of Christopher Walken came up, and Burton would admit to being scared of the idea of working with Christopher Walken. But still, Walken did take on the role and in fact would develop a working relationship with Tim Burton that would see them reunite a little bit further down the line. One of the advantages as far as Burton was concerned of where they were going to shoot the movie, I'll come to this shortly, but they decided to shoot in Los Angeles rather than London this time, was it meant that he could bring in more American-based actors for little roles, and one of them was Paul Rubens coming in effectively as the father of the Penguin. Now, Rubin, of course, had been the star of Tim Burton's first feature, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, but the role of the Penguin's father was actually offered to someone else first. An offer went out to Burgess Meredith, who'd played the Penguin in the 1960s Batman series and films, but Meredith's ill health meant that he couldn't take that on, and the opportunity went in Rubin's direction as well. The filming was originally assumed to be returning to Pinewood in London, where production designer Anton Furst had built the mesmeric sets of the first movie, and Warner Brothers unusually had kept the sets standing. Ordinarily, they would just be packed away at the end of a production, so the next could be shipped in. But Warner Brothers paid a premium so it could keep those sets up, and it had an eye on filming not just one Batman movie there, but a second sequel as well, so making a trilogy out of the sets that had been put up. But Burton had a bit more control this time, and one of the things he wanted to do was avoid quite the intense level of press scrutiny that he was subjected to on the first film, that the Pinewood Studios setting really for the production didn't protect him from as much as he ideally would have liked. And so he asked really if they could shoot the new Batman film in Burbank on the Warner Brothers lot. This request was of course granted. Warner Brothers wanted Burton back, and what it meant was first sets did have to come down, and in came Bo Welch as production designer this time around, who would evolve the ideas that First had put on screen. Now, it didn't mean that First wasn't an option to take on production design role with the new Batman movie, but he was contractually unable to do so and couldn't return to the film, and tragically he would take his own life just after filming began on Batman 2. Filming was underway on the 3rd of September 1991, and this was a gigantic production that took over the bulk of Warner Brothers' Burbank lot. Not just Warner Brothers either. Stage 12 at Universal Studios across town was also being used, and 8 sound stages at Warner Brothers were needed in the end to do it. And the reason for this was the film was shot entirely on Warner Brothers sound stages and Universal sound stages. This was not a location-driven film. film. And one of the advantages of that is it gave them security. It meant that the lenses of the paparazzi and the reporters were going nowhere near the film, or even if they tried, they weren't going to be able to sneak secrets out particularly. And this huge veil of secrecy was just drawn over the film. I mean, we knew who was in it. We knew who the villains were going to be. I mean, Warner Brothers would launch a marketing campaign that told us in no uncertain terms it was the bat, the cat, the penguin. Now, leaning into just the levels of press secrecy over the film, Premiere Magazine, the much-missed American version of Premiere Magazine, did a set report for Batman Returns, put it on the front cover, not with pictures of the film or anything like that, but the front cover picture was Michael Keaton at the wooden door of the Batman set, beckoning people in, playing into the fact that this was a top-secret movie and you weren't going to find anything else about it until people were ready to talk to you about it. It went as far as Danny DeVito, who would reportedly stay in character between all the way through filming, was said to not even be talking about the film with his family. That there was a level of secrecy and paranoia over leaking secrets that was right the way through the film. DeVito was going through hours of makeup a day. In fact, it got down to 3 by the end of the shoot, and he was watching a lot of movies while he was sat in the makeup chair. There was, despite all the secrecy that Warner Brothers had put in, there was one leak that one person managed to sneak a picture off the set of the film. Warner Brothers dealt with this in a very quiet and measured way by promptly hiring a private investigator to try and track down who had leaked the image, apparently not with success. But on set, the actors were going through a fair amount. Michael Keaton, for instance, he was back in the bat suit. Now, it was made slightly more comfortable. Apparently there was a zipper put in there so that Bruce Wayne really could do his necessaries when he needed to do them. But it was still a restrictive costume. Moving his neck was a bit of a job in itself. But it was still a little bit easier than the suit that he'd experienced on the 1989 film. Someone who didn't have it easier at all was Michelle Pfeiffer. No such comfort there. Her PVC Catwoman outfit was hugely restricted to the point where she could only wear it fully fastened up for short periods of time, do the sequences, and then just be allowed basically to breathe out. Not for nothing did she go through around 60 suits during the making of the movie, and the suits were not cheap to put together either. On the animal side of things, there were challenges there. I mean, the humans were having struggles, but the film also needed penguins, very visibly fake penguins at one point. But there were actual real-life penguins that were on the set of the film, as well as 30 puppets that were made for it as well. A bit of computerized stuff in there. And the practicalities of having real-life penguins on your set, and the penguins had to be relocated from the UK to America for the shoot, was you had to chill the sound stages down. That doesn't sound cheap in the slightest. And even though the film got a relatively clean bill of health over its treatment of animals, Burton has spoken in the past about just how important that is to him, there was some controversy over the fact that the penguins were put in a plane and sent across the channel. So there was a little bit of protest over that. Back to the humans, though, and a lot of the criticism of the film would be aimed, as it was with the first film, at the fact that the villains seemed to dominate it, that they were, certainly in terms of screen time and screen impact, they were far more interesting than Batman. And in the case of Batman Returns, in the bat suit, Michael Keaton doesn't actually say an awful lot. But as Daniel Waters recalled to The Hollywood Reporter, his version of the script had a lot more Batman and Bruce Wayne speeches, but it was Michael Keaton who would go through the script and say, it's a good line, but you've got to cut it. It's a good speech, but you've got to take it out. And especially in the Batsuit, Keaton wanted as little to say. He wanted less and less to say because he realised, as Waters put it, that Keaton preferred to let the suit do most of the talking. And Michael Keaton is quoted as saying, once I'd realised how powerful the suit was in terms of an image on the screen, I just used it. It turned out to be a very physical production making Batman Returns, one that would come to an end on the 20th of February 1992, just as Warner Brothers was ramping up the publicity for the film and putting out the first trailer for it. Imagine the first trailer for a film only coming out 4 months before the release. I mean, in blockbuster terms, it just feels alien to us now. The fast post-production of the movie led to a People report coming out in May of 1992 that declared that there hadn't really been time for full test screenings, although there had been some built in there. As a result of that, there was a change just added to the end just about 2 weeks before the release of the movie. An extra sequence was put in just at the very end involving the character of Catwoman. Michelle Pfeiffer was not available. It's a double that you see at the very denouement of the movie, which I'm not spoiling. But whilst the film was going through its production, whilst it was going through its editing process, well, the Warner Brothers business machine around it was ramping up. In fact, in truth, it had been ramping up for years because licensing work on Batman Returns started all the way back in 1990. And why wouldn't it? 1989's Batman had been a cultural phenomenon. If you slapped the bat signal onto something, it was going to sell a lot. And so when it became known that Warner Brothers was definitely going to be doing a Batman 2, it was a bit of a queue around the block for major brands and major companies to be part and parcel of it. Why would you not want to be? And so you got companies such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola putting in tens of millions of dollars to ally themselves to what was the surefire blockbuster of 1992. There were Batman concessions being set up in US department stores, hundreds of them around the country. There was a Batman ride appearing for the first time at a Six Flags theme park. There was an endless supply of merchandise coming through, and as the Hollywood Reporter just got to the nub of what the problem was for the filmmakers, because as Tim Burton said at the time with the first Batman, you'd never heard the word franchise. On the second one, you started to hear that word. And as Burton added, on the second one, we started to get comments from McDonald's like, what's all the black stuff coming out of the penguin's mouth? So people were just starting to think of these films in terms of marketing, and that's the New World Order. And so Warner Brothers, as you heard from the trailer extract at the start, was marketing the film in a very conventional way. But what was becoming clear from the footage that had come through and from the post-production was that this was a lot more of a Tim Burton film. This was very much more the film that Burton wanted to make and the Batman that Burton really wanted to put on screen. And so Warner Brothers, in its heart of hearts, must have known it had some degree of a problem here, because the film was going out with a PG-13 rating. It was playing to the broadest possible audience that it could, and yet the film itself was dark. Much darker than the first film, and very, very much not the blockbuster movie that Warner Brothers was really selling in its promotion. So, I mean, it went before critics, and the reception to the film was, I mean, it was all right. I mean, we're talking critical responses to blockbuster films, so it's never fully the make and break of a movie. But there was, I mean, the things that were being criticised were the very, very loose narrative to the movie. On the plus side, the characterisation, the style of it, that was getting plaudits. But there was a sense very early on that people were taken by surprise at just what they were being presented with. If the first Batman film was very much a Warner Brothers more mandated movie that played a lot safer with a blockbuster audience, well, the sequel just wasn't. And when it's talked about to this day, it is a really unusual, a really dark sequel that goes to the kind of places you wouldn't expect a summer blockbuster of this ilk, certainly not in the 1990s, to go to. But still, would the audience go for it? That was the next question. I mean, critics be damned, right? And the early signs were hugely positive, because just as the first Batman movie had set box office opening weekend records, so the second one did as well. The enthusiasm for the film was gigantic. The opening weekend, June the 19th to the 21st in the US, $45.6 million. That was an extraordinary number. No film had opened to that level ever before. And the early sign for Warner Brothers was, this is going to be hugely positive. We have another monster hit on our hands. I mean, tellingly, every other studio gave it a wide berth. There is, if you go through that box office chart for that weekend in the US, there is not another new major release. Instead, in second place is Sister Act with 7 million, which had been out for 4 weeks. Patriot Games, 3 weeks. House Sitter, starring Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn, that was the new opener the week before. That was now down to 4th. Lethal Weapon 3 had already given Warner Brothers one hit that summer, 6 weeks gone. on, the films that were rounding out the top 10 had been around for some time, right the way through to Basic Instinct in 10th place on its 14th week of release. The warning signs for Warner Brothers, though, came in two forms. Number one, there was a fairly quick backlash from parents who, when they took their kids to see the film with the Happy Meal and all the tie-in toys, were presented with something that they were not expecting at all and took a lot of explaining to certain children. Then there were the licensees who were looking at it and with a degree of what the hell have we got involved with? McDonald's, for one, was said to be horrified, but also McDonald's was contractually tied to it, that it was running this Happy Meal promotion with this really dark, twisted Tim Burton film for weeks. It couldn't suddenly cancel it. It had to press ahead, and it too was taking a lot of backlash from parents that it just wasn't expecting at all. Meanwhile, on the film's second weekend of release in the US, this is where the warning signs were just getting a little bit louder and clearer for Warner Brothers, because Batman Returns lost 44% of its business. Now, in modern times, that's not a bad number, but compared to the original Batman, well, it suddenly looked like the second Batman movie wouldn't quite have the same blockbuster, it wouldn't have the same legs, really. That Unlawful Entry, starring Kurt Russell, opened that second week with 10 million. Batman Returns still number one by a lot, but it would only just hold off the challenge of A League of Their Own on its third week of release. A League of Their Own opened with 13.7 million. Batman Returns was on 13.8. Boomerang, starring Eddie Murphy, was on 13.6. These weren't films that were playing for exactly the same audience either. But when Universal Soldier popped along the week after and helped itself to 10 million, A League of Their Own took the top spot, went from second to first, as Batman Returns was suddenly down to fourth place. These were disappointing numbers for Warner Brothers, even in the era where it was said that a sequel was expected to do 65% of the business of the first film, which I think was roughly what Batman Returns did in the US. There was a hope that this would blast out, that this would endure, that this would break the rules a little bit, and quite the opposite. It was a film that was still huge, just not as big as the first movie. Had Burton made them the other way round, or certainly if the box office returns had come the other way round, champagne all round. But it gone from a high of 250 million for the first film in the US to, well, Batman Returns would top out at the US box office with a total in the end of 162 million, and that was a long way down. Overseas, it would add 100 million. I mean, this was not a failure. The film had cost about 80 million to make, very expensive, sure, but it was going to make the profit, and the home video release did very well, thank you very much. But alarm bells at Warner Brothers. This was not what it was expecting, and as the word of mouth started to drain, Warner Brothers started to reassess its plans for Batman 3. Now, Burton, in retrospect, would argue that Warner Brothers wasn't really a fan. In fact, going back to that Mark Salisbury book, he just says, I don't think Warners were very happy with the movie. That's my feeling. He said, I'd put them through a lot, but I was just trying to give them a good movie. And Burton also was fairly upfront, fairly early on, that Batman 3 was not of interest to him. Even though they'd seeded where a third film could go, that Billy D. Williams was in place as Harvey Dent for a potential Harvey Two-Face villain in Batman 3, well, Warner Brothers was looking at an about turn. Because as in the Hollywood Reporter retrospective piece, Burton says, I don't know if any of my ideas for Batman 3 made it in. He said, I realised halfway through my meeting with Warner Brothers, they didn't really want me to do the movie. They kept saying, don't you want to go back and do a movie like Edward Scissorhands, something smaller? And Burton asked them outright, you don't want me to do it, do you? And the truth is, no, they didn't. Because what they wanted to do was find that audience from the first film again. They wanted something where they could more easily sell product to licensees. And in the end, what they wanted was the Joel Schumacher directed Batman Forever that would be, well, let's just say it would lead to far fewer complaints from parents, far fewer crying children, just it would impress far fewer Batman fans. What's interesting about Batman Returns is, as much as it was ranked a critical, well, a slight critical disappointment, but certainly financial disappointment on its release, it is a film that is talked about a lot. It was quite notable that when its 30th anniversary came around last year, this has been recorded in November 2023, there were a lot of pieces writing about the film and just really what a standout, quite special sequel it is. As Daniel Waters would note, one of the criticisms put to him was, it's a Batman movie for people who don't like Batman, and he completely took that criticism on board. I like Batman. I like Batman Returns an awful lot, and history has proven that in this case I'm not actually alone. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do my half-time parish notices, if that's okay. And, well, let's start with, if you like this podcast and wouldn't mind giving it a bit of support, firstly, thank you. Secondly, there are three main ways you can do so, short of listening to it, and I'm very grateful that you're listening to it. If you want to put some money in the pot and financially support this podcast and all that goes into it, then if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew, what you get there is, in return for putting some funds in, you find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You get the podcast early, pretty much every week. You also get the podcast completely ad-free too. So that's patreon.com/SimonBrew. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. For I can't tell you how valuable this is to independent podcasts, because it's things like that that affect the algorithms and the metrics and all the fancy stuff I don't quite understand, and help get podcasts like this noticed. And the other way too is, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps me a lot too. Meanwhile, Film Stories isn't just a podcast, it's also print magazines as well, proper old style print film magazines. And what we champion through Film Stories magazine is kind of the cinema that's been neglected a little bit while the glare's been on all the superheroes. I like superheroes, but they're covered extensively elsewhere. Instead, we seek out kind of the films that just really, I think, deserve a little bit more limelight. I'm up to issue 46 of Film Stories magazine now. I'm working on issue 47 as this has been recorded. You can purchase copies at store.filmstories.co.uk. I'm really proud of all the stories we've managed to get into print so far. Hopefully a lot more to come. And then we've got Film Junior magazine, a very special place in my heart for this one. This is, to my knowledge, the only print film magazine for young film fans, primarily written by them as well. I'm doing some fundraising for that too at the moment, but if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can pick yourself up a copy. But I think that's enough parish notices for now. I want to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm staying in the 1990s for it, and as always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the film in question. I will come to the story the other side of this.
It's like organized confusion. Over 300-400 degrees in temperature. And then you just got these guys that are running into this building. Everybody else is running out. And these lunatics are running in.
Is that a real Chicago fireman's outfit I see on you?
It's in the blood, Willie.
When I heard that both McCaffrey brothers were being assigned here at this station together, my heart was filled with a sudden desire to transfer.
Run, damn you! Let's just have one drill, Lieutenant. Now one for the company and one for me.
You have a bad day here, somebody dies.
Check that door for heat.
I mean, is that an accident or is it arson?
I'll get that answer as soon as I do.
We're starting to get the feeling that your office is dragging out this case.
So that then was a clip from the trailer from 1991's Backdraft, using a little bit of James Horner's wonderful score for the film Glory in there. Backdraft, written by Gregory Wyden, directed by Ron Howard, starring Kurt Russell, William Baldwin, Scott Glenn, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Rebecca De Mornay, Donald Sutherland and Robert De Niro. And it was back in 1987 that a writer by the name of, wouldn't you know it, Gregory Wyden, who'd been a firefighter for several years, pitched the idea of what would become the film Backdraft to a producer by the name of Richard B. Lewis. Now, Lewis at this point was at Trilogy Entertainment, and he was quite taken with the idea, and so Wyden and Lewis, they packaged this up and they found a buyer fairly quickly at the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, headed by Dino De Laurentiis. Now, as much as Dino De Laurentiis is a legendary producer in Hollywood circles, I mean, go back to the Flash Gordon episode of this particular podcast for more on him, his group was not having the best of times towards the end of the 1980s, so much so that the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group went bankrupt. And really what should have been a fairly quick story of getting a film to the screen suddenly got just a little bit more complex. The bankruptcy meant that the rights were in flux just for a little bit. They eventually came back to Wyden and Lewis, and so now by October of 1988, so we're over a year into the story already, the idea had come across the desk of one Ron Howard. Now, Ron Howard's background, of course, is in acting, but across the 1980s, well, he made his directorial debut in 1977 with Grand Theft Auto, nothing to do with the game that would come out many years later. But it was across the 1980s that he started to make a splash in more ways than one with directorial efforts such as Night Shift, Splash, Cocoon and 1988's Willow, which is where we find him in this story, because he was preparing. I mean, he had another film just on his docket at that point, the 1989 comedy Parenthood that I've covered in a previous episode of this podcast. Parenthood is a masterpiece. I must have that chat again at some point. And he was a director in demand, and no wonder. He could make impressive commercial films on a relatively modest budget. He'd got several hits to his belt as well, and through his Imagine Entertainment company that he ran along with producer Brian Grazer, there was a feeling that the firefighter project, Backdraft, let's go with, well, it was something he could get behind. Now, the version of the film that was being mooted at this point was a lot cheaper than the one we ultimately got. It was going to cost $15 million, and Howard thought he could probably shoot this in the summer of 1989. The focus of the story being quite narrow at that point, that it would focus on an arson investigation amongst a crew of firefighters. But Howard kept noodling with the story. He wasn't particularly satisfied. He didn't think they'd nailed it, and he wanted to expand it a little. In fact, he wanted to bring in the story of a pair of brothers at the heart of the movie, and he wanted other writers to come in to help him fashion that bit of the story. And as such, Gregory Wyden found himself just sidelined as other screenwriters came in to take a crack at the Backdraft script. So, as Wyden would tell the Wall Street Journal, in fact, he felt he was, quote, banished for a year as 3 new writers were assigned. So, come the start of 1989, I've got the name of one of the writers for a start. That would be Michael Bortman, and he was linked with the movie. But by the autumn of 89, there wasn't a completed script in place, and there wasn't even a certainty that Ron Howard was actually going to direct this. He was in post-production on Parenthood that had moved up his schedule, and script rewrites on the Backdraft project were still going. In fact, they were still going at the start of 1990 as well. Enter stage left legendary action director Stephen E. D'Souza, and he was hired to particularly look at the story of the 2 brothers that Howard wanted at the heart of the film. But again, he was wavering in terms of whether he would direct it himself. Would this be a project that Imagine would produce, for instance, or would it be one that Howard stepped behind the camera again for? Now, Howard would ultimately direct, but the script was continuing to elude him for a while, and he had other projects on his docket as well. I mean, Far and Away was slowly coming to fruition as well. But could the Backdraft project be salvaged, and could it be salvaged in time to fit the gap that Howard had in his schedule? Well, the answer to that was yes. And it was salvaged in part by bringing the original writer back. Who knew? Gregory Wyden was brought back onto the film in early 1990, and he spent what he described as several days getting the script back to a place that Ron Howard was happy with. So much so that Ron Howard decided, yeah, all right, this is going to be my next film. And with Universal backing him via his Imagine banner, and why wouldn't Universal back him given the money that Parenthood had just made for the studio, the plan now was, let's film this in the summer of 1990, and Backdraft would then be released in the summer of 1991, that Universal would have another tentpole picture to add to its summer lineup, and with a trusted director at the helm of it. Casting-wise, though, this had expanded. That original story of an arson investigator would still be in there, but then so would the brothers' story as well. And as much as the promotion to Backdraft promoted the fact that it was an ensemble film, there were a lot of names above the title here, it was still the core of these two brothers at the heart of it, the McCaffrey brothers. And lots of auditions were taking place. In fact, if you go online, you can see Robert Downey Jr.'s audition for a role in Backdraft. Keanu Reeves was said to have put his name forward as well. Brad Pitt, too, was also said to have been put on tape as a potential for the film, but it would be William Baldwin who would ultimately emerge victorious. And there's a lovely story. I couldn't get a double source on it, but it's worth just noting it, that Baldwin actually had a commitment to a role in Ridley Scott's Thelma and Louise at the same time that he had to release, and that opened the door apparently for Brad Pitt, who didn't get the Backdraft role, but got really a career opening role in Thelma and Louise. Now, quite how true or not that is, I don't know, but I did like the story, so I'll just throw it in with that caveat to it. Now, someone who was in the air when he first heard of the movie was Kurt Russell. That Kurt Russell was a keen pilot, and he was flying with a man called Tom Cruise. Who knew? And so Cruise started talking to Russell while they were on this flight about taking on a potential role in the film Days of Thunder that Cruise was lining up. And Russell really wasn't biting at that point. I have covered Days of Thunder on a previous episode, but as Entertainment Weekly noted, Cruise changed the subject it wrote to another script he'd been considering, a drama about two firefighter brothers working side by side in a Chicago firehouse. Now, this was far more interesting to Kurt Russell, and so once they landed and he got home, Russell called up his agent. It's like, tell me more about this firefighter film. And Ron Howard, he freely admitted he'd been after Tom Cruise to lead the movie. Why wouldn't he? And the ideal for a while was that Kurt Russell and Tom Cruise would be brothers. They would eventually work together on Vanilla Sky, but it didn't pan out on this particular project, because instead, whilst Cruise was interested for a while, he had commitments elsewhere. It wouldn't be long until he worked with Ron Howard, far and away, again just around the corner, and Russell found himself paired with William Baldwin instead at the head of the ensemble that was attracting some impressive names. Jennifer Jason Leigh and Rebecca De Mornay came aboard fairly quickly, as did Donald Sutherland. Then there was the small matter of Robert De Niro, who was at the point in his career where he was starting to look at taking cameo roles on in films such as this, and this would be a small supporting role, but an important one as the arson investigator. As Ron Howard told The Hollywood Reporter, he was hugely impressed with De Niro's process, that De Niro met different fire investigators, said Howard, and when they rolled cameras, I realised he adopted the posture of one guy, the attitude of another, and sort of cadence and commanded the vernacular from a third. And Howard reflected, I realised this is what De Niro does. It was a masterclass in preparation and application. But then preparation was running right the way through the Backdraft project, and with good reason. This was pre the era where you would just get a load of visual effects in to do the work for you. Howard and his team knew that if they wanted to put roaring fires on screen, they needed roaring fires. And it was several months in advance that work was underway on just how do you present fire in the most interesting way on screen? How do you make the explosions work? And so the production team was working on that. Meanwhile, the ensemble cast, just ahead of filming, was sent off to work with the Chicago Fire Academy because, again, Howard knew that for the fire sequences to work, he needed to put his actors in the midst of them. He needed it to be faithful. And so De Niro, on the one hand, was doing his stuff, but the actors too, the rest of the actors, were going through the process and learning the basics of what they had to represent on screen. Filming would begin on the 25th of July 1990. A lot of the production took place in Chicago, as you would expect, given that it's a Chicago set film, that in some cases they brought sets onto location shoots as well, just so that they could get the fire, really, to wreak havoc with the fire in the locations that they'd chosen. There were 16 weeks scheduled for the shoot, lots and lots of practical work. And all right towards the end of the shoot, a major road in Chicago was shut off for a funeral sequence that required extras, and out went the call for extras. And in the end, 600 off-duty firefighters came along and took part. You see off-duty firefighters in the movie as well. That the drive for authenticity, and also, face it, respecting firefighters was very key in Howard's mind. But still, the practical problems of filming fire were a big challenge. If one of us, for instance, just set something on fire, I'm not suggesting we would, but just a fire in the middle of nowhere, fire then produces a lot of smoke and a lot of ash. And that wasn't really going to look particularly cinematic, nor was it helpful if you want to look at Kurt Russell's head when there's a load of smoke and a load of ash blowing into his face. That they knew that it would obscure the view of the audience and it just wouldn't quite look right. You look at how the dramatic, the lengths really they go to present rain looking authentic on screen and how they have to cheat to do that. They were sort of having to do this with fire as well. Now, Hollywood for on-screen fire tends to use propane as its fuel of choice. This is not a how-to guide. Do not try any of this at home. You are not suing me. But to get the kind of black smoke effect that they needed for the camera, what they added was a little bit of diesel as well. Then they brought in assorted chemicals just to give extra colour to the flames as well. For the tracks that they needed to lay for the flames to follow, they put glue on the floor, they put fuel there as well. And in the end, the bill for the fire effects came in at just over $1 million, which sounds to me like a bit of a bargain, but then I didn't have to pay for it. The total budget for the film had ballooned up to the 35-40 million range, unsurprising given the size of the cast. But it's interesting just what a small proportion the acclaimed effects in the film took out of that budget. Again, had this been done with computers, you would expect that bill to be an awful lot higher. The person who was charged with shooting all of this was a director by the name of Mikhail Salomon. He would go off and direct features himself. Hard Rain was one of his that came a little bit further down the line. And he knew he had to keep his cameras safe. And so he used a product called a Claremont camera firebox. Now, Claremont have not paid me for inclusion in this podcast. I don't even know if they still exist. But for the purposes of this story, it meant that the camera could be housed in secure casing that would resist the heat. And it meant that the camera could be put in the midst of the action. Howard, though, would, in a retrospective piece with The Hollywood Reporter, just muse over the fact that it was still dangerous for all the safety tips and all the safety, all the concern they had for safety on the film. He did say we had gas burners and fire retardants and a team of 10 Chicago firefighters around us at all times with extinguishers at the ready, but they needed to move in at times because Howard said no matter how well planned, we just never knew when the fire was going to get away from us, and it did on occasion. Pity the camera operator who was put in the fireproof suit and given a handheld cam to go through the flames with the handheld camera and capture some of the close-up footage that we get in the film. But still, even though the actors and even though the crew were facing down the flames, they weren't complaining about it really, because they knew that what they were representing was what people do, what other people do, less paid people do, on a day-to-day basis, that they knew that they couldn't really grumble when actual firefighters were having to face this regularly. And as Russell said in a piece, he just said all of us were getting burned every day. He said your hair would burn, you put this gel on to keep your skin from burning, but it also attracted these little bits of ash which got stuck to your face. Billy, William Baldwin, got set on fire twice. I got set on fire 3 times. Scott Glenn got fried once, Russell threw in. There's a sentence as well. And Russell did add that one of the firemen who worked with us and won commendations and awards as a firefighter said that in 14 years he'd never got burned on the job till he did this, quote, goddamn movie, Now I've Been Burned Twice. But still, as Entertainment Weekly noted, there were no serious injuries during the production of Backdraft, that the actors were able to be in the heart of the dangerous scenes, but the precautions paid off. And as the article said, these actors are in there flat out doing it, putting out fires. Most of that work, again, done on sets, but when you think about it, it's one of those things that a second take of a lot of this was very, very tricky, because if you're burning a set, you're burning a set. And so while they put a special paint coating on the walls just to give them a chance at getting extra takes, they knew that they had to nail this a lot of the time, first time, because otherwise the thing was bluntly burned. Filming would wrap up on December the 8th of 1990, and Backdraft would be preparing for what would be a very, very, very busy summer. Summer of 1991, after all, was the season of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, of Terminator 2. Bruce Willis was going to be back with Hudson Hawk. Big things were expected of that. And so Universal had positioned this for a May 1991 release in the US and was spending on the promotion with, a poster that made a lot of the flames, but also a lot of the star names. In fact, the trailer that you got a clip from right at the start there was not shy about hitting you with the full, as much of the cast really as it could possibly put on screen, and building up the fact that you were going to get this real spectacle for your money. And in fact, when the film went in front of reviewers, that was the feedback that they were quickly getting. That the critical response to Backdraft was so on the drama at the heart of it, but the special effects were just universally praised. The fact that practically what they'd been able to realise looked so good was universally praised. The performances as well, there's a lot of good performances in Backdraft. It's the kind of ensemble where everyone gets a little bit of space to do what they do, and those were relatively well praised as well. There's a lot of upbeat notices for the film. It's only the story really, the fairly straightforward story of two brothers at the heart, ironically enough, was the bit where it attracted the most criticism. But still, there was confidence. However, the summer of 1991 was an interesting one in Hollywood because this was the year really where a lot of films started to misfire a little bit. And so we go to the Memorial Day weekend of 1991 when Backdraft opened. And in fairness, it opened in first place, 15 million over the extended Memorial Day weekend, ahead of the number 2 film, which was What About Bob, and comfortably ahead of Hudson Hawk. Big things had been expected of that. That opened with a whimper in third place. There was also Thelma and Louise was around. That opened the same weekend. Only the Lonely, the new film from the John Hughes staple, starring John Candy. Not doing great guns. Drop Dead Fred with Rick Mayall. That was in the top 10 just about. FX2, Madonna, Truth or Dare, Switch. That was the competition that it was up against. Universal scheduling meant that it had got a little bit of space to itself. The biggest opening film the following week was Soap Dish, the ensemble comedy. I really like Soap Dish, actually. I don't mention it very often, but it's well worth seeking out. And Backdraft held the top spot, 9.1 million on its second weekend, dropping only 28% of its business. Not a lot of competition. To give an overview of how light the competition was, Home Alone was in 9th place on its 29th week of release. Stone Cold had come in at 10th. Remember Stone Cold? That kind of action film. More of those on the big screen, please. It was City Slickers the following week that knocked it off the top chart. The surprise hit of the summer, really, that was. And City Slickers helped itself to 13 million. Spike Lee's Jungle Fever was up against it on its third week as well. But Backdraft was kind of holding its own, and it wasn't until Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves came along, written by Penn Denson and John Watson, who I've had on this podcast before, who were also involved in Backdraft, that really its run at the box office started to peter out. And then, again, a curious summer. Julia Roberts in Dying Young followed the week after, and big things expected of that never really happened. The Rocketeer, big things expected of that, lots of acclaim, not much box office. And it was reliables, really, like a Naked Gun sequel and a Terminator sequel. That were the kind of things that were making the money that summer. Backdraft, though, it didn't drop out the top 10 for a good 7-8 weeks. And in fact, by the time it had completed its run in US cinemas, it was up to 77 million. And, we look at that kind of number, not an awful lot by today's standards, but at that point, that was a pretty reasonable return, particularly in such a flat summer where so many films had misfired. Backdraft was just regarded as one that had held its own. Overseas, it did roughly around the same amount of money as well. And there was also further acclaim coming a little bit down the road for it. That, come the Academy Awards, well, unsurprisingly, Backdraft was in the mix. It was up for sound effects editing, and visual effects. However, how's this for luck? Found itself up against Terminator 2 Judgment Day in all 3 categories and promptly lost. That notwithstanding, there was sufficient interest in Backdraft for Universal to revisit it, 20, 30 years later. It was in 2018 came the news that we were getting a Backdraft 2 that would also see William Baldwin back. This was one of Universal's straight-to-DVD jobs, and I mean, in the end, you did get William Baldwin, you got a bit of Donald Sutherland in there as well, but it was pretty much a different thing, not aimed at cinemas in the slightest. The reception to it was nowhere near as good, and whilst you can find the film out there, I don't think many people are particularly championing it. And in fact, the final word on Backdraft really goes to Ron Howard, who, when he's been looking at retrospective pieces to do with the film, and it comes up an awful lot, he suggested that the future for Backdraft might be as a TV series. Not a bad idea, perhaps. The 1991 ensemble summer drama, though, stands pretty much alone, even if you can't track down a copy of that straight-to-DVD sequel. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/YouTube, I was going to say, youtube.com/filmstories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. We're doing loads of stuff on there at the moment. Do give it a look if you don't mind. And if you head to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy our print magazines, our Blu-rays and other such paraphernalia. That's it though for this episode. I'm going off to watch another load of films now, and so that leaves me to say that the main thing is, as always, you all stay safe and well. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Ta-ta.